OK, well, let's now take a closer look at some stories in Behind the Headlines. And Good Word News is reporting that the Tunisian president, as we know, Kais Saied, moves on the economy and COVID-19. The situation in the country, as we know, is pretty desperate in places, but he has dismissed the Prime Minister and he has suspended Parliament too. Denmark could face legal action over attempts to return Syrian refugees to their homeland, despite the ongoing conflict, as reported in the news website Insider Voice. Here in the UK, the Daily Mail is reporting that health officials in Britain say we are very close to achieving herd immunity against COVID-19. And my favourite story of the day: where would you go if there was a global collapse of society? Well, the Evening Standard is reporting that the overwhelming choice is New Zealand. And if there is a global catastrophe, I want to take these two journalists with me. Juliet Foster here and Nabila. Thank you very much for joining us, Nabila Ramdani. Thank you. So let's start with our first story about Tunisia. Juliet, we're learning now a little bit more about why he's done this. Yesterday we were feeling it was a coup, it was a power struggle, and then today he's come out and said, no, the COVID situation is so out of control, the economy is shot to shreds, I needed to do something about it. Has he got a point, do you think?
To a certain extent, yes, because there is endemic corruption in the country. He was talking about business leaders, or accusing some business leaders of stealing around $13 billion or over. No doubt whatsoever that the COVID response has been very, very poor. But I think if you broaden things out a little bit more, the political deadlock, that situation that we're seeing in Tunisia, it smacks of something much deeper, going back to 2014 and the constitution. You had an attempt by Parliament to actually, well, let's put it this way. What happens is that you have the powers between the president and the Prime Minister and Parliament. So it's the old thing about the legislature versus the executive. Now, there was an act ratified by Parliament to bring in the Constitutional Court, and its job was to effectively resolve those differences, areas which perhaps neither side could agree to. And this is why, for example, you have this ongoing conflict between both sides about the appointment of certain key figures to various ministries, etc. I mean, it's very, very familiar. But what we're seeing now, I would argue, is really an extension of this whole conflict. There's these strike points between the two sides. That's not to say that the arguments about the state of the economy, the handling of COVID-19 are a smokescreen for something deeper. They're part of it. But this has happened at a very bad time for Tunisia because of COVID-19, but also the references to corruption and the need to actually bring the economy on track. That's an element of appealing, if you like, to the International Monetary Fund, because Tunisia needs money. The real problem the president has is that he has suspended the parliament for 30 days. He's effectively given himself a month-long roadmap, a credible roadmap. It needs to be credible to the international community and, above all, to Tunisians. Whether he can actually
Julia,
produce
I'm going to
something
stop you there for a moment because we're going to come on to that in a second. But I just want to say, Nabila, do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, absolutely. I think Juliet is spot on when she says that we have to look at the wider picture, which is a constitutional crisis. And in effect, constitutional events in Tunisia attract huge interest around the world because the country played such an important role in the Arab Spring a decade ago. But what is happening at the moment does not inspire a great deal of optimism, I have to say. The Arab Spring was all about ending autocratic rule by a popular uprising, but there we have a President Kais Saied invoking emergency powers. He says that he needs to do this not only because of the North African country's dire economic situation and because of alleged corruption, but also because of the chaos caused by the coronavirus pandemic. You do feel that this is an extreme example of governments using the health emergency to impose their rule. And in this case, Said's opponents are calling it a full-blown coup. And public anger had been growing in Tunisia for many years. But we must remember that the 2010 to 2011 revolt was largely a peaceful one that is often called the Jasmine Revolution. I actually was in Tunisia at the time of the revolt, and it was very quick and very effective, in that it soon led to the demise of long-term President Ben Ali. But against this tradition of relatively gentle revolution, it is terrible to see Saied acting in such an autocratic fashion. He claims that his actions are constitutional, but there is little evidence that he's sticking to democratic principles, and instead he's relying on his security chiefs, and in particular the military, to maintain his powers. Juliette mentioned how he has suspended parliament for at least 30 days and even replaced the director of a prominent Tunisian TV station in what looks like a clampdown on free speech. And he's also trying to enforce a long-standing rule banning gatherings of more than 3 people in public, which is not something that democratic protesters will be happy to put up with. So much so that foreign powers such as the US and indeed France have joined opposition groups in calling for Saied to produce a speedy roadmap to exit the crisis within a month. So the next few weeks are going to be crucial, and this is certainly the sternest test yet to Tunisia's democratic system since the Arab Spring revolt ended successfully in 2011.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Let's move on, though, to our second story. Insider Voice is reporting that Denmark could face legal action over their attempts to return Syrian refugees. So, Juliette, let's come to you on this. So Denmark is basically saying, look, Damascus is now safe. The civil war has moved on. There's no reason why these refugees can't go back home and restart their lives. Doesn't it, to a point, have a point there? Damascus is a lot safer than it was. Maybe it is time for people to start looking at coming home.
To which, Jeff, in answer to that question, I would flip it and put it back to you. If Damascus is as safe as the Danes say, then why is it that the United Nations disagrees with that? Can I also stress as well, and it rather depends on whose news channel you look at. Just because Syria has fallen off the coverage radar, it doesn't mean that all is quiet and that this country has somehow managed to correct itself, put the past behind it, it's now stable, and everything is fine. That is not the case. I think the key thing is that the United Nations, they have their people on the ground. They see this for themselves. They're gathering the evidence. They have said that Damascus is not safe. Look, let's be clear about this. The reason why the Danes are taking this measure is because of what is happening in European politics or liberal democracies generally. In other words, you have populist right-wing parties and governments which perhaps in the month of Sundays wouldn't necessarily embrace some of the ideas from these groups. They're using them to stay in power. In other words, they want to show that they're tough on immigration. What is really worrying, there are 2 points about what the Danes are doing that is very, very worrying. First of all, by saying that Damascus is safe, they're effectively saying, or targeting, if you like, women, the elderly, and children. Why? Because if you are male and you left Syria and you didn't serve your military, you didn't do your military service, you managed to dodge the draft, you could be punished by the authorities. So in that sense, you have a very strong case for actually not returning to Syria. On the other hand, if you are a woman and you have children, you have elderly people, you can send them back. So it looks very good for the numbers,
doesn't it? So that's going to separate families then, isn't it? That's
it's
the
going
point.
to
That's
separate families. It's going to separate families, and that is the inhumanity of it. That is the inhumanity. So we should never, ever forget that. And at the end of the day, the Danes are not working in isolation. If they manage to launch this model, I would bet you £1,000 that you will have the Home Office, which will take some of those elements and they will apply it here. Because what this tells us is that the whole approach to migration is changing. if you're not actually bending the rules to suit yourself, it's being outsourced. We saw how the Australians did that they actually took migrants and dumped them in South Sea Islands. We've actually heard anecdotal reports of the Home Office in this country actually having conversations with the Rwandan authorities. So yes, if you're willing to actually allow your country to be a host to some of the world's most desperate people, you can make a lot of money out of it.
So, Nabila, Juliet's just saying there that we might see this sort of thing happening in England, in other places as well. Do you see that? Do you see this setting a dangerous precedent for other countries?
Yes, indeed, very much so. I can tell you, I was in Syria just before the start of the Arab Spring revolt there, and have been following the progress of the hellish war there ever since, and do not believe for a moment that any part of the country can be considered as safe today, not least because there is still regular shelling going on. And yet Denmark is actively trying to return hundreds of Syrians to Damascus after deeming the city safe. And if they get away with it, this will set an immensely dangerous precedent to other countries to do the same. And this is not just the view of those who are well informed about the reality of modern Syria, but also of lawyers who are preparing to take the Danish government to the European Court of Human Rights over the issue. About 1,200 people from Damascus currently living in Denmark are believed to be affected by the policy there. But of course, thousands more people will be affected. Damascus is giving any credibility. The whole truth is that the revolt against President Bashar al-Assad started a decade ago when he started murdering his own civilians in response to the Arab Spring revolt. Since then, there have been non-stop crimes against humanity carried out in the country, including the use of poison gas on civilians. And Bashar al-Assad is, of course, still very much in power. So the idea that peace and stability has now simply returned is absolutely absurd.
OK, let's just move on quickly to our last two stories. And if you could make your answers brief, I'd be very appreciative. Juliet, herd immunity. We've nearly reached it in the UK. Now, for the last 18 months, the words herd immunity, they're dirty words, aren't they? We haven't wanted to hear it. Herd immunity, no, no, no. And suddenly we're saying, congratulations, we're nearly at herd immunity. Is this a good thing or a bad thing, Juliet?
Well, I would actually argue that it's probably a bad thing in the sense that it actually sends out the signal that we're over the worst of COVID, that it's nearly over, we can actually return to normal. We're not out of the woods yet. Remember that a sizable proportion of the population has been vaccinated, but there are still some people who have not been vaccinated. There are some individuals who've only received one jab. And don't forget as well that whilst we're talking about herd immunity, at one point we heard the government in the United Kingdom talking about the possibility of booster vaccinations. In other words, we don't know whether the current vaccines that have been received so far, how resistant they are to other strains of this illness. So yes, on the one hand, it's very good news that some of the infection figures within the last week appear to be showing a downward trend, but we're not out of the woods yet. And it doesn't mean that we have to drop our safeguards. We should still be responsible as citizens.
Nabila, at times during this pandemic, the UK has been a prime example of what not to do, hasn't it? But we do seem to be coming out of this quicker than other nations, don't we? Are people now looking to Britain and saying this is the way forward? Briefly, if you will.
I think so. And if the science holds up, this is an absolutely wonderful story. And it comes from an excellent academic institution. University College London scientists estimate 80% of the country's population has some protection against the coronavirus. So I think, this basically states that, for example, if 80% of the population is immune, 4 out of every 5 people who run into somebody with the disease will not get sick and absolutely won't spread the disease further. So, once we reach that magic figure of around 80%, then the pandemic will start to fizzle out. But as Juliet quite rightly said, I think there's also a case to be made to remain cautious. We just need to look at countries such as the US, where figures are spiraling, and are out of control. So this is the kind of reminder that we need to bear in mind.
OK, we've just got time to go on to our final story, which is my favourite. New Zealand has been voted the place that most people should go to if there is some sort of collapse in society. Juliet, briefly, if you will, what sort of collapse in society are they suggesting, and why on earth should we go to New Zealand?
Well, New Zealand's a fantastic country, and I need to stress now that I am not on the payroll of the New Zealand Tourism Board. But I think that my interpretation of this was that they were looking at a social collapse, largely as a result of environmental factors coming through, because they were talking about mass migration, people movement, population displacement, because sea levels have risen. I mean, we have some of these extraordinary weather things which are happening at the moment, the wildfires, the flooding, etc. And I guess that New Zealand, and not just New Zealand, I hasten to add as well, it topped the list, yes, but also you had Iceland, Tasmania, and even the United Kingdom, that they had certain advantages in their favour. They had the capacity to actually produce more food, to actually manufacture. In other words, to be sustainable, resilient. And that's the key to it. So if you actually are resilient in all the things that matter, then whilst you can actually survive massive population displacements, whether it actually gets you through a nuclear attack is another thing altogether. But hey, let's all go to New Zealand. I've been there before, so any excuse to go back, I'm up for it.
Absolutely. Nabila, in 2 words, if you will, one word, which country would you head to? New Zealand, Iceland, or the UK? Or Ireland? That's on the list as well.
Well, I have to say I'm pretty happy in the UK, so I'll stick with that.
All right, so you're staying in the UK. Me and Juliet are heading off to New Zealand. I'll see you at the airport. Thank you both very much indeed for that. Well, that's it from now on this edition of Behind the Headlines.